The Andersons had built their reputation on the warmth and kindness they showed to every traveler who passed through their quiet village. Their sprawling farmhouse, nestled on the edge of town, was a picture-perfect retreat, surrounded by acres of lush greenery. Travelers raved about the peaceful atmosphere and the impeccable service, making it a popular choice for anyone seeking a break from the busy pace of life. With the scent of fresh flowers in the air and the sound of birds chirping, everything seemed idyllic. But behind the flawless exterior, there was an almost unnatural calmness about the family that some couldn't quite place. They were the embodiment of hospitality, but something in the air made it clear that their charm wasn't just for show. One evening, a guest named Mark arrived, eager to experience the Andersons' legendary hospitality. He was exhausted from his travels, looking for a place to rest and unwind. As he stepped out of his car and approached the front door, the house seemed to welcome him in a way that felt almost too deliberate, as though it was waiting for him. The Andersons greeted him warmly, with smiles that stretched just a little too wide, as though rehearsed. Their words were honeyed, almost too perfect, and yet there was something strange in the way they made him feel, like he was stepping into a scene from a picture-perfect dream, but one that wasn't quite real. Still, he pushed aside the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, attributing it to his tiredness. As he settled into his room, the charm of the place seemed to continue its pull, offering him comfort and relaxation. The room was immaculate, with fresh linens, warm lighting, and a faint scent of lavender in the air. The Andersons had anticipated his every need, providing him with more than he could have ever asked for. Dinner was served promptly, and the food was exquisite, nothing less than what one would expect from such a reputed guest house. But there was a sense of unease that crept over Mark as the night deepened. It wasn't the food or the atmosphere, but the way the Andersons seemed to watch him when they thought he wasn't looking. It was subtle, but it made his skin crawl. Mark dismissed it as his imagination, still determined to enjoy the peaceful respite the Andersons had promised. But when he retired to his room, the unsettling feeling grew. He noticed that the door had a lock from the inside, an unusual feature for a guest room. He tried to shake off the thought, but the stillness of the house, the way everything seemed to be perfectly in place, only added to the strange sense that he wasn't alone. The wind howled outside, but there was no creaking of the old house, no sounds at all, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house. Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the longer he stayed, the more he felt like he was being watched. It was as if the house itself was aware of his every move, every thought. At that moment, the true tension of the story began to take root. The Andersons' hospitality was not the only thing that made their home attractive. It was the way they drew people in, seemingly without effort. There was a magnetic pull to the house, one that worked on all who entered. As Mark lay there, he realized that his initial discomfort was not merely a fleeting feeling. It was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. But by then, it was too late to leave. The family's perfect invitation had already pulled him into their web, and the house had already begun to claim him as its next guest. It happened on a cold, moonless night. Mark, who had been staying at the Andersons' guest house for several days, simply disappeared. One moment he was in his room, the next, nothing. No sign of struggle, no noise, no trace of where he had gone. His belongings were untouched, and his bed was still made, as if he had never even been there. The Andersons were the first to notice his absence the following morning and immediately contacted the authorities. When the police arrived, they began their search, combing the house and the surrounding area for any signs of Mark. But despite their efforts, there was no clue, no evidence that could explain what had happened to him. It was as if Mark had vanished into thin air. Throughout the investigation, the Andersons remained disturbingly calm. They acted concerned, of course, but there was something about their demeanor that felt too controlled, too rehearsed. They welcomed the police officers into their home with wide smiles, offering tea and pastries while the officers searched every corner of the property. They claimed it was all just a misunderstanding that would surely be cleared up soon. When the officers found no signs of foul play or forced entry, they were left with nothing to go on other than the odd behavior of the family themselves. And yet the Andersons seemed unfazed, almost indifferent to the growing sense of unease that permeated the air. Over the course of several days, the investigation seemed to lose momentum. The police, unable to find any substantial evidence, eventually gave up. The case was quietly closed and the news began to fade from the headlines, leaving only whispers among the villagers. Those who had visited the Andersons before started to speak out, telling stories of strange occurrences they had witnessed during their stays. Some spoke of hearing footsteps in the hallways late at night, others of hearing faint whispers just beyond the walls. A few guests claimed to have seen the Andersons' eyes follow them when they thought no one was watching, as if the family was always observing. The stories varied, but all painted the same unsettling picture, that something about the house and its inhabitants was deeply wrong. Despite the growing rumors, the Andersons continued to run their guest house as if nothing had changed. They greeted new guests with the same warm smiles, offering them comfort and reassurance, as though the disappearance of Mark had been nothing more than an unfortunate fluke. They were quick to dismiss any concerns raised by guests, explaining away the strange noises and locked doors as quirks of an old, creaky house. "It's just the wind," they would say, or "old houses do that sometimes." But beneath their reassuring words, there was an unmistakable tension, a coldness in their eyes that guests couldn't ignore, even if they tried. As the weeks passed, life at the guest house seemed to return to normal, but the strange occurrences only increased. The air in the house felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. The villagers, once eager to visit, now whispered about the Andersons in hushed tones, exchanging stories about things they had seen or heard. Yet no one could explain why the Andersons seemed so untouched by the mystery surrounding their guest's disappearance. It was as if the family was part of something larger, something far more sinister than anyone could comprehend. The calmness with which they moved through the world only deepened the sense of unease, and soon the house itself seemed to be a prison, one from which no one could escape. As the weeks passed, more and more guests arrived at the Andersons' guest house, unaware of the dark history lurking beneath the surface. At first, the charm of the house and the warm hospitality of the Andersons continued to make the place seem like a perfect getaway. But it wasn't long before whispers began to spread among the visitors. Late at night, some guests reported hearing strange noises, whispers that seemed to float through the halls, barely audible but unmistakable. The voices were indistinct, but they had a certain eerie tone to them that chilled the spine. Others spoke of the sensation of being watched, as though unseen eyes were following them through every room. Still, when guests asked the Andersons about it, they simply smiled and assured them it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind, or the imagination playing tricks. The odd occurrences escalated as more guests arrived. One woman, staying alone in one of the rooms, reported that she felt as though the walls of her room were closing in on her. She described a suffocating pressure that seemed to intensify the longer she stayed. It wasn't just the physical confinement, it was the overwhelming feeling that there was no way out. Despite her discomfort, the Andersons continued to assure her that everything was perfectly fine. They explained that the house was old and had its quirks, but there was no need for concern. However, the woman's anxiety continued to grow, and her once peaceful stay turned into a constant battle against an unseen force that she couldn't explain. One evening, another guest, a man who had grown suspicious of the house's strange atmosphere, decided he would leave early. He had heard the whispers, felt the stifling air in his room, and was determined not to spend another night in that oppressive environment. But as he made his way to the door, he found it locked from the outside, as though someone had deliberately trapped him in. He knocked on the door, but no one responded. His heart pounded in his chest as panic set in. He tried the windows, but they were sealed shut. It was as though the house itself had decided he wasn't allowed to leave. The realization sank in like a cold weight. He wasn't just imagining things. Something dark and unexplainable was at work here. In the days that followed, a few more guests began to voice their growing unease. But each time, the Andersons brushed off their concerns with an almost practiced ease. "It's just an old house," they would say. "You'll get used to it." The family's dismissive attitude did little to quell the rising dread that had begun to infect the minds of the visitors. Those who had stayed at the guest house for a longer time began to notice strange patterns. Items in the rooms would move when no one was around. Small objects like books, trinkets, or even furniture would be subtly out of place. It wasn't enough to be sure that something was wrong, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of their necks. The tension in the house grew palpable, but without any concrete proof, the guests felt as if they were losing their grip on reality. A couple of particularly skeptical guests, a married couple who had heard rumors about the Andersons, decided to investigate the house for themselves. They had an unnerving suspicion that there was more to the Andersons' hospitality than met the eye. One evening, after the Andersons retired for the night, the couple snuck out of their rooms and began to explore the more isolated parts of the house. It was then that they stumbled upon a series of hidden rooms in the basement, rooms that had been deliberately concealed behind walls and false doors. They were full of old furniture, forgotten relics, and strange symbols etched into the walls. The couple took note of everything, but the deeper they ventured into the house, the more they felt as though they were being drawn into something ancient and dangerous. The hidden rooms were not the only unsettling discovery. In one of the rooms, they found a collection of dusty journals, written in a language neither of them recognized. The entries seemed to describe rituals, ceremonies, and strange practices that were tied to the Anderson family's bloodline. The couple's discovery was chilling, but they couldn't fully comprehend what they had stumbled upon. The more they read, the more it became clear that the Andersons were part of something much darker than mere hospitality. The family's practices went beyond mere tradition. They were involved in ancient, forbidden rites that seemed to center around power, control, and the manipulation of others. As the couple pieced together more of the family's disturbing history, they began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls of the house seemed to be closing in on them, just as they had on the previous guests. It wasn't just the physical space that felt claustrophobic. It was the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. They realized that the house itself was not just a building. It was a prison, a trap, designed to ensnare anyone who came too close to uncovering its secrets. The Andersons were not simply acting out of a desire for hospitality. They were using their guest house as a lure, drawing people into their world of darkness and hidden horrors. The couple's investigation took a terrifying turn when they realized that the Andersons had been watching them the entire time. The sense of being observed, the eerie calm in the family's demeanor, and the deliberate way in which they moved through the house all began to make sense. The Andersons weren't just benign hosts, they were the puppeteers, orchestrating a twisted game that had been played for generations. As the couple tried to leave, the house seemed to resist them, the walls tightening, the air thickening, as if the house itself had come alive, hungry for their souls. And in that moment, they understood the true nature of the Andersons' power. They were feeding off the fear, the confusion, and the terror of their guests, trapping them in an endless cycle of horror. A new group of guests arrived at the Andersons' guest house one late afternoon. Among them was a local historian named Thomas, a man with a sharp mind and a deep interest in the region's history. He had heard rumors about the Andersons' mysterious past, and he had come to investigate them, intending to write a book about the area's hidden secrets. To the Andersons, Thomas seemed like any other guest, eager for a quiet stay. But to Thomas, this was more than just a retreat. It was an opportunity to uncover the truth. Little did he know, The moment he stepped inside, he had already become part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Thomas spent the first few days of his stay exploring the village, interviewing locals, and diving into old records. He quickly became intrigued by the whispers surrounding the Anderson family. The more he dug, the more the pieces began to fit together. He discovered that the Andersons' guest house had been built upon land with a sinister history, land that had been tied to strange, almost forbidden rituals in the past. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the family's involvement in occult practices, with rumors that their prosperity had come at a terrible price. These rituals were said to have been passed down through generations, hidden from the world, but never fully erased from the region's lore. Curious, Thomas delved deeper into the family's personal history, finding references to dark symbols and cryptic texts in old journals. He pieced together an unsettling pattern. The Andersons' wealth and influence were not the results of hard work or good fortune, but the result of sacrifices made in exchange for power and immortality. His research revealed that the family's guest house had become the perfect cover for their twisted practices, luring unsuspecting travelers into their grasp. With each revelation, Thomas became more certain that the Andersons were not just innocent hoteliers. They were part of something ancient and terrifying. They had turned their home into a trap, and every guest who stayed was just another pawn in their ritualistic games. As Thomas continued to investigate, he began to feel the oppressive presence of the house around him. Strange things started happening. Late at night, he would hear footsteps echoing in the hallways, always just out of sight. Objects in his room would move ever so slightly, as though someone was tampering with his things. The Andersons seemed to know his every move, as though they were watching him constantly. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of his search, of his growing suspicion. The family's calm demeanor only made the situation worse. They were acting like everything was normal, but Thomas could tell they were starting to grow wary of his questions. They were waiting for him to discover the truth, and they were preparing for what would come next. Despite his mounting fear, Thomas pressed on with his investigation. He began to notice something even more disturbing. The house itself seemed to be changing. The walls felt like they were shifting, and rooms he had previously explored now appeared different, as though they had been rearranged. It was as if the house was alive, responding to his every move, pushing him closer to the truth, but also to an inevitable fate. Late one evening, Thomas found a hidden door in the library, one he hadn't noticed before. Behind it, he discovered a secret room filled with ancient relics, books of occult knowledge, and strange artifacts. The air was thick with dust and age-old power. As he rummaged through the items, he realized that this was the heart of the Andersons' secret. The room was a shrine to dark forces, a place where rituals had been performed for centuries. The more he uncovered, the more Thomas realized that he was running out of time. The Andersons had noticed his investigation, and their behavior had become increasingly strange. They no longer welcomed him with their usual warmth. Instead, they seemed cold and distant, watching him with suspicion in their eyes. Thomas began to feel as though he were being herded, pushed toward a destiny he had not chosen. He tried to leave, but the house refused to let him go. Doors that had once been easy to open were now locked. Hallways stretched endlessly, leading him back to the same rooms. It was as if the house had become a maze, designed to trap him inside its dark secrets. The Andersons had prepared for this moment, and they were not going to let him leave until they had completed their plan. As the days passed, Thomas grew increasingly paranoid. Every time he turned around, there was someone watching him, usually from the shadows. The Andersons seemed to be everywhere, smiling, nodding, but always just a little too close, always with a knowing look in their eyes. The more he uncovered about their past, the more he realized that his time was running out. The Andersons were preparing for something horrific, and he was the final piece in their twisted puzzle. The rituals he had discovered were about to be completed, and Thomas, unknowingly, had become their next victim. The sense of dread in the house grew unbearable. He had stumbled into a nightmare, and there was no way out. The family's true intentions became clear when Thomas finally confronted them, demanding answers. The Andersons, with their perfectly controlled smiles, revealed that they had been aware of his investigation all along. They welcomed his discovery, for it meant that the time had come to complete the ritual, and Thomas was to be their final offering. The historian had come looking for a story, but he had unknowingly walked into a centuries-old trap. As the Andersons led him into the heart of their dark domain, he realized too late that the true horror was not in what he had uncovered, but in the fate that awaited him, one he could no longer escape. The historian's discovery began when he found an old chest hidden deep within the basement of the guest house. Inside were several journals, each older than the last, filled with strange symbols and archaic writing. As he painstakingly translated the text, he uncovered details that chilled him to his core. The journals chronicled generations of the Anderson family, each entry describing the same dark practices passed down through the bloodline. The family, it seemed, had long been devoted to the occult, using their hospitality as a cover for their unspeakable rituals. Each guest, every traveler who had stayed in the house, had unknowingly been drawn into a web of dark magic and sacrifice. The rituals, designed to feed dark forces, were performed in secret, and the offerings, these innocent victims, were a key to the Andersons' continued prosperity. As the historian read on, the true nature of the Andersons' power became disturbingly clear. The family had made a pact with an ancient force, a malevolent entity that had promised them wealth, immortality, and influence in exchange for blood. Over the centuries, they had lured unsuspecting travelers to their guest house, offering them comfort and sanctuary, only to betray them when they least expected it. The sacrifices were performed in the dead of night, the blood of the victims used to seal their pact with the dark powers that had granted them their endless wealth. The historian realized that this was no mere family tradition. It was an insidious cycle that had been repeating itself for generations. The Andersons were not just wealthy, they were immortal, and the price for their prosperity had always been the lives of the innocent. The historian, shaken by his findings, knew that he had to confront the Andersons. Armed with the knowledge of their dark history, he made his way to the family's parlor, where they were gathered as if waiting for him. When he confronted them with the truth, expecting shock or denial, he was met only with eerie smiles. The Andersons didn't try to hide their deeds. Instead, they seemed almost pleased that he had uncovered their secrets. They explained with unsettling calm that he, too, had now become a part of their family. They had been expecting him, watching him with growing interest as he dug deeper into their history. The historian, it seemed, had unknowingly walked right into their trap, just as countless others had before him. With chilling clarity, the Andersons explained their motives. They revealed that they had been using the guest house for decades to lure victims, always one step ahead of the law. Every disappearance, every strange occurrence in the house had been part of a well-orchestrated plan to maintain their grip on power. They had always been careful, always covered their tracks, ensuring that no one would ever uncover the truth. They had managed to remain undetected for so long because they had the perfect cover: hospitality. Their victims never suspected that the warmth of their welcome was just a facade, a lure to draw them into the family's sinister web. The historian had been no different. He had come seeking knowledge, and instead, he had become the next offering to the dark forces that kept the Andersons immortal. As the historian tried to process the horrific truth, the Andersons' smiles only grew wider. They explained that the sacrifices weren't just necessary for their immortality, they were part of a greater plan. The dark powers they had bound themselves to demanded tribute, and the Andersons had been all too willing to comply. Their guests, they revealed, were not just victims, they were pawns in a grand scheme to maintain control over the living world. The historian's blood would be the next to feed the entity that had granted the family their power. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just a guest, he was a sacrifice, and there was no escape. Desperate to flee, the historian made a run for it. But as he tried to leave, the house itself seemed to resist him. The doors that had once been open now slammed shut with a force that made his heart race. The windows, once welcoming, were now sealed, as if the house had decided to keep him inside. Panic surged through him as he realized that his efforts to escape were futile. The house was alive in a way he couldn't fully understand, and it was determined to keep him. He turned and ran down the hall, but the house twisted around him, the corridors shifting in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping him in an endless maze with no way out. The Andersons followed him calmly, their footsteps echoing through the halls as they watched him struggle. They didn't need to chase him. They knew the house would trap him. The historian's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. The Andersons were waiting for him to accept his fate, to understand that he was already a part of their dark family. The ritual was set in motion, and no one, not even someone as resourceful as the historian, could escape its grip. As the realization sank in, he understood with a sinking heart that he was not the first to try to flee, nor would he be the last. The house had claimed countless others, and it was about to claim him as well. With each passing moment, the historian grew weaker, the suffocating sense of doom pressing in on him. He could feel the presence of the dark forces that the Andersons had been feeding, their eyes watching him from the corners of the house, waiting for his final surrender. The Andersons, now standing in front of him, revealed their true nature, not just as hosts, but as eternal servants to the darkness. They had offered everything, including their humanity, in exchange for immortality, and now, as the historian's fate was sealed, he knew that the house would continue its cycle of horror. He had uncovered the past, but in doing so, he had become part of it, a new victim, destined to feed the darkness that had ruled the Andersons for generations. Clara had been staying at the Andersons' guest house for several days, and she had started to feel uneasy long before the tension began to build. At first, the warm hospitality of the family had lulled her into a false sense of security, but as the days passed, something in the house began to feel off. She had noticed the subtle changes, how the family always seemed to know her movements, how their smiles never quite reached their eyes, how the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. She overheard snippets of conversations between the Andersons in hushed tones, talking about the ceremony, the next one, and the offering. It was then that she realized the horrifying truth. She was next. One night, after the family had retired to their rooms, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She had already seen other guests come and go, some of them looking unsettled, others missing altogether. But what had really begun to eat away at her was the growing realization that she might not leave the guest house alive. In the dead of night, Clara ventured through the house, following the faint sounds of conversation that seemed to drift from one of the back rooms. As she crept closer, she overheard the Andersons discussing their plans for the upcoming ceremony. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This was no ordinary guest house. It was a trap, and she was the next victim. Terrified, Clara's mind raced. She knew that the Andersons weren't just running a guest house. They were preparing for something much darker. She quickly packed her things, determined to leave before it was too late. But as she made her way to the front door, she found it locked. The same sense of suffocating claustrophobia she had seen others experience now closed in on her. She ran to the windows, but they too were sealed shut. Panic set in as she realized that no matter what she tried, there was no escape. The Andersons were waiting for her, and she was trapped. They had known she would try to flee. In this house, no one left unless they were part of the family's dark cycle. The Andersons appeared in the doorway, their smiles as cold as ice. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as they calmly explained that no one ever truly left the guest house. Every guest, whether they knew it or not, was now part of the cycle. Those who survived the ritual were invited back, their memories wiped clean of what had truly happened, while the others, they simply disappeared. The family explained it all matter-of-factly, as though they were discussing a mundane event. But the terror on Clara's face was undeniable. She was caught, just like all the others before her. The Andersons had already planned for her fate. She was either going to join their twisted family, or she would become another offering to the dark forces that kept them immortal. With a sickening sense of finality, the Andersons gave Clara her choice. They had already claimed the souls of countless others, all who had been drawn into their web of deception. Now Clara had to make a decision: become part of their family, an eternal servant of the darkness, or face the same fate as the others who had come before her. The chilling weight of her choice pressed on her chest as she realized that there was no escape. The house, the family, the dark forces, they were all intertwined in a cycle that had lasted for generations. And now, Clara was about to become the newest piece of their horrific puzzle. Clara stood at the center of the darkened room, the cold stone floor pressing against her bare feet. The Andersons, dressed in long, dark robes, surrounded her, their eyes fixed on her with chilling intensity. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles, their flames casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, an ancient power that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Clara could feel it, an undeniable force that seemed to be alive, pulling at her very soul. Her heart raced as she realized that this was no ordinary ceremony. The Andersons weren't just a family. They were bound to something far darker, a force that had been feeding on the lives of their guests for generations. As the chanting began, Clara's mind raced. The Andersons' voices rose in unison, the words foreign and incomprehensible, filling the room with an eerie cadence. It was as though the language itself had power, each syllable summoning an ancient presence that had long been waiting. The flickering candles cast strange, twisting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, mirroring the sinister rituals that had been passed down through the Anderson bloodline. Clara's hands trembled, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. This was it, the moment of no return. She had been chosen, and the ceremony was about to reach its terrifying conclusion. But Clara refused to accept her fate. With every ounce of strength she could summon, Clara struggled against the bonds that held her. Her arms and legs were tied to the cold stone altar, but her will to survive burned brighter than ever. As the Andersons continued their chant, their eyes glowing with an unnatural fervor, Clara twisted and pulled with all her might. The ropes dug into her skin, but she fought against them, desperation fueling her every move. The more she fought, the more she realized that the family was not just performing a ritual, they were summoning something, a force beyond their control, a force that had been feeding on their sacrifices for centuries. Clara's body trembled not just from fear, but from the weight of the dark powers that surrounded her. The candles flickered violently, their flames sputtering as if caught in a struggle of their own. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very essence of the house was alive, feeding on the energy of the ritual. Clara's mind swam with the realization that she wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her very soul. The Andersons, their faces twisted with unnatural fervor, were not just performing a ceremony. They were enslaved to the darkness, bound by a curse they could never escape. Clara's struggle intensified as she realized that this cycle had been repeating for generations. Each guest, each sacrifice, was a part of an eternal chain that the Andersons were powerless to break. In a burst of panic-fueled strength, Clara finally managed to tear through the ropes that bound her. The force of her struggle knocked over a candle, sending a wave of fire across the altar. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The Andersons froze, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury as Clara broke free. The room was filled with the crackling sound of the fire, and the family's chants faltered. Clara didn't waste a second. She scrambled to her feet, her body aching, her mind reeling with fear and adrenaline. The Andersons shouted, their voices rising in anger, but Clara was already running, dodging past them as she made for the door. But as she reached the exit, a chilling realization dawned on her. The door was closed, locked by some unseen force. It wasn't just the Andersons keeping her in, it was the house itself. The very walls seemed to close in on her, and she realized that there was no escaping the cycle. The Andersons, their dark eyes filled with malevolent determination, had been waiting for her to make her move. Clara turned, her pulse pounding in her ears, to find the family closing in around her, their faces expressionless, but full of something much darker. The air in the room thickened, and the weight of the dark forces pressed down on her like a physical presence. There was no way out. She was trapped, and the family's dark legacy was about to claim her. As the Andersons moved toward her, Clara knew that there was no hope for escape. The family had been preparing for this moment for decades, perhaps even centuries. She had only been one more piece in their ritualistic game, just as countless others before her had been. The curse that bound them had claimed yet another soul, and Clara was about to become part of the Andersons' legacy, a legacy that stretched back through time, feeding on the innocent, the unsuspecting, and the helpless. In the final moments, as the family reached for her, Clara realized that the true horror wasn't just in what the Andersons had done, it was in the fact that they were slaves to a darkness that would never let them go, a darkness that had claimed her as well. The camera cuts to black, the sound of Clara's screams echoing faintly in the distance. The audience is left in the darkness, unsure of what happened next. Was Clara consumed by the family's curse, or did she manage to escape? Was the darkness truly defeated, or did it claim yet another soul? The chilling uncertainty lingers, leaving the viewers with an unsettling feeling that no matter what happened, the Andersons' legacy would continue. The cycle would repeat, and the house would always call out for new victims, forever trapped in the shadows. The horror was not over. It was only just beginning. Clara's escape sent shockwaves through the world. She exposed the Andersons' horrifying practices to the authorities, detailing the dark rituals, the sacrifices, and the centuries-old pact that had sustained their twisted legacy. The family's evil was finally laid bare, and the guest house was seized by law enforcement. The once idyllic house, which had hosted countless unsuspecting travelers, was now a crime scene, its walls echoing with the memories of the horrors that had transpired there. The village, though shocked, began the long process of trying to forget, hoping the nightmare would end with the Andersons' capture. But the truth was far more elusive than anyone had imagined. The authorities scoured the property, but there was no sign of the Anderson family, no trace of where they had gone or how they had vanished without a trace. The house was locked down, the windows boarded, and the village went on with their lives, trying to move past the darkness that had gripped their community for so long. Yet, despite the official closure of the case, the atmosphere around the guest house remained unsettling. The once quiet village now felt tense, as if the land itself had been cursed, haunted by the echoes of past wrongdoings. The air felt thick, as if something was waiting just beneath the surface, never fully gone. As the years passed, the rumors about the Anderson family never truly died. People still spoke of strange occurrences around the house, even after it had been abandoned. Locals claimed to see shadows moving in the windows at night, flickering behind the boarded-up walls. Others reported hearing whispers carried on the wind, voices in a language that no one recognized, murmuring words that were both comforting and terrifying. Despite the authorities' assurances that the family had vanished for good, the house remained a source of dread and mystery, as if the very foundations were steeped in an evil that refused to be erased. More disturbing still were the strange disappearances that began to occur in the surrounding area. While they couldn't be directly linked to the Anderson family, whispers began to spread that the family's dark influence still lingered. Travelers who passed too close to the guest house would sometimes vanish, only to be found days later, wandering in a trance, unable to recall what had happened. It was as though the house itself was reaching out, pulling people into its grip. Even though the Andersons were nowhere to be found, the village tried to dismiss these events as coincidence, but the fear in the air was undeniable. The legacy of the Anderson family was far from over. Clara, now living in a distant city, couldn't escape the memories of what she had witnessed. Though she had exposed the truth, the horror continued to haunt her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Andersons' faces, their cold, predatory smiles etched in her mind. She had escaped the house, but she hadn't escaped its influence. She would often wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from the shadows of her room. The more she tried to move on, the more the past reached out to her, pulling her back into the nightmare that had almost claimed her life. And the whispers, they always grew louder, as if the family was still calling her. As Clara struggled to move forward, the house itself remained a silent witness to its dark past. Despite the efforts to seal it off, there were always rumors of people attempting to visit the infamous guest house. Some were thrill-seekers, others desperate to uncover the truth for themselves. But every person who dared to approach the house seemed to disappear, swallowed up by the same darkness that had consumed the Anderson family's victims. The house was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol of the evil that lingered in the shadows, waiting to claim new souls. The Andersons may have disappeared, but their legacy lived on, a lingering curse that refused to be shaken. The chilling finality of it all was suffocating. Though Clara had uncovered the truth, she realized that the nightmare would never truly end. The Andersons had bound themselves to something much older and darker than anyone could fully understand. Their bloodline had been cursed long ago, and that curse was destined to continue as long as the house stood. The village, the authorities, and even Clara herself were all part of a much larger story, a story that had no true ending. The cycle of horror would persist, and as long as the house remained, the Andersons' dark legacy would wait for its next victim. As the camera panned away from the house, now crumbling but still ominous in the distance, the screen cut to black. The whispers in the wind grew louder, almost deafening. The final shot lingered for a moment before fading out entirely. The question remained, unanswered and unspoken. Had the Andersons truly vanished, or were they still out there, watching, waiting? The chilling uncertainty left a cold shiver running down the spine of the audience, knowing that the terror was never truly over. The darkness had simply shifted, and it would rise again when the time was right.